Quaid-e-Azam's dedication to the service of the nation echoes the Islamic principle that true leadership involves serving others selflessly. His vision for a progressive and tolerant society reflects the Islamic teachings of compassion, kindness, and acceptance of diversity. Jinnah's emphasis on education and enlightenment resonates with the Islamic emphasis on seeking knowledge as a means to progress and enlightenment. He advocated for economic justice and equal opportunities, in line with Islamic principles of equitable distribution and fair economic practices. Quaid-e-Azam's belief in the importance of unity and cohesion among different provinces mirrors the Islamic concept of fostering unity among diverse communities. His belief in the power of democracy and governance through consultation aligns with the Islamic principle of shura, consultation, in decision-making. Jinnah's commitment to human rights and dignity is in harmony with the Islamic teachings that uphold the sanctity of human life and honor. His emphasis on moral values and ethical conduct reflects the Islamic emphasis on upholding moral integrity and ethical behavior in all aspects of life. Quaid-e-Azam's determination and resilience in the face of challenges resonate with the Islamic teaching of sabr, patience, and perseverance in adversity. His belief in the empowerment of women and their participation in nation-building aligns with the Islamic recognition of women's crucial role in society. Quaid-e-Azam's insistence on upholding the rule of law and constitution reflects the Islamic principle of adherence to justice and established norms. His emphasis on hard work and dedication mirrors the Islamic teachings that encourage believers to strive for excellence in all endeavors. Quaid-e-Azam's humility and modesty, despite his monumental role, exemplify the Islamic value of humility before Allah and fellow human beings. He upheld the Islamic values of consultation and consensus building, seeking counsel and consensus in decision-making for the betterment of the nation. Jinnah's commitment to women's rights aligns with the Islamic principles of respect, dignity, and rights granted to women in society. He encouraged a sense of responsibility and accountability, in line with Islamic teachings that emphasize individuals being answerable for their actions. Quaid-e-Azam's unwavering faith in the destiny of Pakistan resonates with the Islamic belief in divine guidance and trust in Allah's plan. His call for unity among Muslims underscores the Islamic principle of brotherhood and solidarity among believers. Jinnah's advocacy for social justice and equality reflects the Islamic emphasis on caring for the less fortunate and addressing societal injustices. His commitment to the welfare of minorities resonates with the Islamic teachings that emphasize protection and respect for religious minorities within an Islamic state. The ultimate aim of the creation of Pakistan was to establish a society based on Islamic principles, where justice, equality, and tolerance would prevail. Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah exemplified the Islamic virtues of patience, determination, and integrity in his tireless struggle for the rights of the people. He believed in the Islamic principle of unity among Muslims and strived for the unity of the nation, irrespective of their backgrounds or differences. Jinnah's life echoes the Islamic values of compassion and empathy, as he worked tirelessly for the welfare and upliftment of the marginalized communities. His commitment to justice mirrors the Islamic concept of fairness and equity, as he advocated for equal rights and opportunities for all citizens. Quaid-e-Azam's unwavering resolve in the face of challenges reflects the Islamic teaching of reliance on Allah and steadfastness in faith. He emphasized the importance of education, echoing the Islamic belief that seeking knowledge is a sacred duty, and it was instrumental in his vision for a progressive society. Jinnah's emphasis on tolerance and coexistence among people of different faiths resonates with the Islamic teachings of respecting diversity and promoting harmony. His selflessness and dedication to the nation resonate with the Islamic concept of serving humanity and prioritizing the welfare of others over personal interests. Quaid-e-Azam's emphasis on unity, faith, and discipline echoes the Islamic principles of unity among believers, unwavering faith in Allah, and maintaining discipline in life.